Good afternoon. As my colleague Jessica noted, thank you for joining us. My name is Ilke Denise. I'm Deputy Director of our nonprofit unit here at MOCS, as well as our agency's Chief Nonprofit Officer. I will keep it short because I know we have a lot of exciting content to cover, but our great partners over at Public Works will be walking you through this presentation. And at any point, if you have any questions, of course, feel free to utilize the chat so we can assist you. Thank you all.
And hi, everyone. Thank you, Ilke. My name is Celeste Fry. I am the Principal and CEO of Public Works Partners. As Ilke mentioned, we are a consulting team that has been partnering with MOCS and New York City OMB on the citywide implementation team since the beginning in 2020. We have had conversations with many of you over the years, and we're excited to walk through this webinar today. I'm also joined by my colleague Alex Fiorilli, who leads a lot of our work with the city implementation team, and he'll be doing part of this presentation as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this will be a helpful and informative webinar. We will also be sharing the deck, as Jessica mentioned, afterwards if you'd like to share it with other folks in your organizations. And please, throughout the presentation, you may put questions in the chat, and we will be addressing them during the Q&A section by about halfway through. So there should be plenty of time to get to as many of the questions as possible. So a brief note, Public Works Partners is a woman-owned consulting firm. We're based here in New York City, and we work primarily with New York City agencies and also with contractors and nonprofit providers like yourselves. Many of us, including both Alex and I, were also city employees at one point as well. We work to bring strong financial and organizational practices to agencies and nonprofits. We've supported the Indirect Cost Rate Initiative from its beginning in 2020, and we're excited to continue our work with the city implementation team, along with MOCS and the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget. So now we're going to go through the agenda for today's webinar. First, we will talk through some background on the Indirect Cost Rate Initiative and some context, as well as the history of the initiative. Then we will dive into the fiscal year 2027 application process. We'll walk you through the steps, the requirements, and also best practices for submitting a timely and accurate application. Then we will talk through sampling and testing, which is our quality assurance measures for ensuring that everyone's ICR is accurate and timely for use with your city contracts. And then we'll go into our Q&A section, and then we'll close out by 1 o'clock with resources and next steps. As Jessica mentioned, we are recording this webinar, and we'll ask that you stay muted, but submit your questions through the chat function. So we're going to start with the introduction and background to the initiative. Next slide. So some quick grounding for those who may be new to the Indirect Cost Rate or ICR initiative. First, what is an indirect cost rate? So an indirect cost rate is something that any provider with New York City Human Services contracts have a budget line in your budget for your contract to pay for indirect costs. Indirect costs include expenses that are not directly linked to your specific program or this contract, but which are essential and contribute to your organization's overall provision of services. Some examples of indirect cost would include personnel expenses related to accounting, human resources, procurement, or legal services, for example. Indirect costs are allocated to your city-funded programs, but also other programs, by determining a rate or percentage of the support that your programs require. Through the ICR initiative, health and human services organizations can acquire a city-accepted rate for budgeting your indirect cost across all of your health and human services contracts and getting paid for them. So once you attain a city-accepted ICR, it will be used across any and all city human services contracts that you have for consistency. So now we'll talk about the background of the initiative. The ICR initiative was first developed in 2019. In February 2019, the City of New York adopted the Indirect Cost Rate Cost Manual to standardize cost allocation practices for health and human services providers who contract with the city. The Mayor's Office of Management and Budget and the Mayor's Office of Contract Services formed the City Implementation Team, or CIT, to design the implementation and rollout of the Indirect Cost Rate Initiative. They then brought Public Works partners on board in early 2020 to support this work. So by December of 2020, the first two cohorts of providers, one for fiscal year 2020 and the other one for fiscal year 2021, had established ICRs through the initiative. Early in those pandemic days, we were all doing a lot of work to get everyone processed in those first groups. Since then, there have been 5 successful ICR application cycles where providers participating in the initiative could either renew their ICR with the city or change it if it needed to be updated, or when new providers could apply to receive an ICR through the initiative. The CIT, or City Implementation Team, also works very closely behind the scenes with all of the different contracting agencies to make sure that there's a lot of communication and that ICRs are shared out for budgeting and payment purposes. Our most recent application cycle, which concluded in May of 2025, saw the largest number of providers applying for new or renewed ICRs. And now this September, we launched the latest application cycle. This application is for fiscal year 2027. So we have switched to a new fall timeline in hopes of making it easier for your contract budgeting and your work with your agencies, which is what we're here to discuss today. So that's the background. Now we're going to begin getting into the FY 2027 application process. How do you know if you are eligible to participate in the fall 2027 application process? If you plan to apply to renew your current ICR, or if you are applying for a new rate with the city this year, this ICR that you are applying for now will be valid starting in fiscal year 2027, which is the city fiscal year beginning July 1st of 2026. ICRs are valid for 3 years from the date they start. So if you have an ICR that is accepted in this cycle, it will be valid from July 1st, 2026 through June 30th of 2029. There are several ways that contracted health and human services organizations are eligible for getting a city-accepted ICR. If you have an accepted ICR that will be expiring on June 30th of 2026, or if you do not have an accepted ICR because your organization entered City Human Services contract since the last application window, or if you have not applied for an accepted ICR during the last application window, and or you defaulted to the 10% de minimis rate, and you still retain city active human services contracts, you can apply, you are eligible to apply for an ICR in this cycle. I am sure there will be some questions that will be submitted in the chat, so I'm just going to pause for 1 second before we go to the next slide. So that's the eligibility criteria. We can go to the next slide now, and we will talk through the application process for this cycle's eligibility open enrollment period, sort of. So the fiscal year 2027 application process, it officially opened a little over a week ago on September 24th, 2025. If you are an eligible provider, you should have received an email through the city's Gov delivery, and you should be able to see the in Passport as well. In order to apply for an ICR in this cycle, you must complete the ICR application and submit relevant supporting documentation to the CIT email address. That email address is cit@mocs.nyc.gov. There are several people on this webinar who regularly monitor and read those emails, so it will generally be acknowledged and confirmed quite quickly. When you submit your application in your email, please indicate in the subject line the name of your organization. That will help us route it more quickly. So in the subject line, please put the name of the organization you are submitting an ICR for. This is especially relevant if you have an independent accountant who's actually submitting on your behalf. It's really helpful to us if we can see the name of the organization in that subject line. So once a provider submits their indirect cost rate application along with supporting documentation, the CIT will review your submission and may come back to you with questions or a request for further documentation. So that's part of the process. If there's anything missing or any clarification that we need, we'll come back to you with some questions. After reviewing the application and resolving any questions, the CIT will then approve a provider's indirect cost rate. At that point, it will be uploaded and made available in Passport along with the eligibility period. That will be visible to your organization and also to your contracting agencies. Again, an accepted ICR that you receive in this application process will be valid from July 1st of 2026 through June 30th of 2029. So if you currently have an accepted ICR in this fiscal year, that accepted indirect cost rate will continue through June 30th of 2026. As you'll see on the slide, there are several deadlines for this application process. So we would like to suggest that you submit your application by November 1st of 2025. If you submit your application by November 1st, we can ensure that you will receive a rate by December 8th of 2025. This can be particularly helpful if you are a provider who is planning to respond to a fall 2025 Human Services RFP. Any RFPs that are coming out this fall that will have a start date in FY 2027, we really encourage you to submit your application for your ICR as soon as possible. That way, it increases the likelihood that you'll have a new accepted rate that will be ready to submit in with your proposal and your budget for any new contracts you'll have. The final deadline for this round of the ICR is December 8th, 2025. If you submit your application by December 8th, we will aim to have accepted rates for all of those providers by January 28th, 2026. That's a little bit longer timeline because there's a lot of holidays in there. All right, so I think that's everything on the application process and the deadlines for that process. Next, we're going to go into the different entryways and the different forms that are involved in the ICR application. There are 3 possible entryways for establishing an accepted ICR with the City of New York. The first one is we refer to as the 10% de minimis rate. This is the basic standard indirect cost rate, and it requires the least amount of documentation. All you have to do to receive the 10% de minimis rate is to submit I believe it's a one-page application form. We'll look at it in a further slide, and it needs to be signed by the executive director of your organization. As long as you submit that simple ICR application, you will receive that 10% rate. If you are a provider who is applying with a rate that is higher than the 10% de minimis rate, you have two options. The first one is if you have a NICRA or a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with the federal government, and you have received an approved rate and you have a letter and documentation to that effect, you may submit that NICRA rate as documentation along with your ICR application. Generally speaking, the City of New York accepts federally accepted NICRA rates. The third potential entryway is submitting an independent accountant's report. So if you want an ICR that is higher than 10%, but you don't have a federal NICRA rate, then you may have your accountant complete and submit the independent accountant's report, the IAR form, and a schedule of ICR, which you will then submit along with your simple ICR application, and we will review review those. So now we're going to walk through what these different documents actually look like. Here's a copy of the sample ICR application form. As you can see, this is the FY27 ICR application that every provider must complete. It includes the top section where you input your organization's basic information, the name of the organization, your tax ID number or employer ID number, the name of the executive director, and an email contact address. The second section is further contact information, especially if the executive director has designated a different staff member to serve as the contact, such as a CFO or a controller for this ICR application. This is where you'd input their information. Then the middle section is where you choose which entryway, meaning the 10% de minimis, the NICRA, or the independent accountant's report that you are applying through. Further in that section, you then indicate which documentation you will attach to this application in support of your proposed ICR, either the current NICRA or the independent accountant's report and the schedule of ICR. And then the final section, which is really crucial, is that the executive director or CEO of the organization must sign the attestation at the bottom of the application. You'll then attach relevant documents such as the IAR or NICRA and submit the application form with the package electronically to cit@mocs.nyc.gov. On the next slide, we will look at what the independent accountant's report looks like. So this is a sample independent accountant's report. It's relevant if you're applying for an ICR of more than 10%. If you're going to submit a schedule done by your accountant. This is not necessary if you're applying with a NICRA or if you want the 10% de minimis rate. This is a sample of the letter that your accountant prepares after reviewing your most recent financial statements. In this letter, your accountant should state that they've examined the schedule of ICR, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and that it is presented in accordance with the ICR cost manual. Note that the financial statements should be your most recent financial statements that you have available. You can find the template for this letter in the link that will be both in the deck, but also I think will be posted in the chat now. And again, you'll submit this letter along with your schedule of ICR and the ICR application to the cit@mocs.nyc.gov email address. So on the next slide, we'll look at what a schedule of ICR looks like. So this is a simple spreadsheet-based form called the schedule of ICR, and this is how your organization's indirect cost rate is calculated. So to calculate an ICR, the city uses a methodology called the Simple Allocation Methodology, or SAM. And this is a template worksheet that we provide that you can use to calculate your ICR using the Simplified Allocation Methodology. Please note, if you plan to use a different methodology, MOCS and OMB greatly prefer if you use this template and use the Simplified Allocation Methodology. If you use a different methodology, this will lengthen the time that it takes for the city to review your ICR. So again, only applicants who are submitting with an independent accountant's report need to submit this schedule document. And then you submit both of those things with your application to the email address. And then on the next slide, we'll show you a template of what a NICRA looks like. So this is an example of a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. They might look a little different depending on what agency they are from, but they should include the same basic information. The document states what is the final rate negotiated with your federal contracting agency, as well as what is that rate's validity period. These pieces of information are very important for the city to be able to accept your negotiated NICRA. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Alex Fiorilli from my team, who will talk through some additional detail to make sure that you are able to submit an application that is accurate and timely and approved very quickly.
Yes, thank you, Celeste. So those of you who are planning to apply, like Celeste said, through the independent accountant reports entryway, we just want to provide some pointers on how to avoid common errors when preparing your schedule of ICR. And for the end of this call, we will also include a link to a ICR template worksheet that we provide for providers to use when preparing that schedule of ICR. But when calculating your ICR using the simplified allocation method, it's important to make sure that you're correctly allocating all personal expenses as either direct, indirect, or mixed. And it's important that we can kind of see in that worksheet each individual line and how they are allocated as either direct, indirect, or mixed. It's also important to correctly allocate lobbying costs, and while they are unallowable per the simplified allocation methodology, it does need to be, lobbying costs do need to be included in the direct cost base. Make sure that's also included when calculating your ICR. You could also remove any distorting items from the direct cost base. So this can be rent, subcontractors over $25,000, equipment expenses over $5,000, and any participant support costs. We'll also include a link at the end to the Health and Human Services cost manual, so you can see how all these costs should be allocated. Additionally, you could allocate all fundraising costs as indirect and unallowable, make sure that's allocated correctly. And then, especially in the worksheet, just making sure any professional services are detailed enough where we know, what's being allocated and how they're being allocated. Sometimes providers will just include a lot of things in miscellaneous, and then we may come back to you with questions about what is included in that miscellaneous category, for example. Next slide. So a few other considerations when applying for an ICR. Some providers, as we know, will submit multiple subsidiary organizations underneath their parent organizations, all submitting together for an applied rate with the city. So if you are doing this, just know that all organizations with a unique employer identification number must submit an individual application. So we need an application for each of those individual EINs. If you're applying using the independent accountants report, please make sure all the subsidiary organizations are listed on that report so we know that that report for your parent organization is applicable to the subsidiaries. Finally, it'll just be helpful if you package all of those together in one email and then just clearly indicate in the body of the email which organizations you are submitting for, just for our own internal due diligence. If you're an audit firm that's applying on behalf of a provider, we also ask please clearly indicate in the subject line the provider's name for whom you're applying for. This just helps us if you're submitting multiple applications for different providers, we can just keep the communications really clear on our end. And then finally, as Celeste said, the simplified allocation methodology is the method used by the city when calculating ICRs for contracting and budgets. So, any use of an alternative method may result in some lengthier review processes on our end. So just want to reemphasize that. Next slide. So all application materials, once you've calculated your ICR and prepared your verifying documentation, should be submitted to our inbox at cit@mocs.nyc.gov. We will review your submitted application within 5 business days to ensure your application is complete and all documentation is submitted. We will try to do it in 5 business days. If it's closer to our deadline, I just want you to know it may take a little longer, but that is what we aim to do. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit on our sampling and testing process. So sampling and testing is a process that we use at CIT to help ensure an equitable and efficient process for our indirect cost rate initiative. So during sampling and testing, we'll select a small number of submitted applications that will undergo further review just to provide a bit of quality assurance on our end to make sure applications are following the cost manual and correctly allocating their costs. Next slide. So if you are selected for sampling and testing, we will email you and request further documentation for this additional layer of review. We will advise within 5 business days of your submission whether you've been selected. And then once we've reviewed your materials, we may come back to you with some follow-up questions or even some requests for revisions if we find that allocations in your schedule of ICR are not in line with the cost manuals, policies, and procedures. Once any questions have been resolved or corrections made, we will then notify you when your application has been approved. And of course, we will be available for assistance through this process. If providers want to schedule a call with us to just talk through anything, we will be available for that. Okay, so then using your ICR. So now you have your rate, it's been accepted. Congratulations. So your indirect cost rate can be used across the full lifespan of your contracts with your agency. So, we advise that providers use this indirect cost rate when calculating and submitting any proposal budgets in response to RFPs. We do want to just recognize that some agencies may be requesting respondents' budget at a 10% de minimis rate until right sizing of the contract can be achieved. So we're currently working with agencies to ensure a standard policy approach to that longer term, but just wanted to acknowledge that we're aware of that. the ICR can be used for when contracting. So your contracting agency will baseline your planned indirect spending to the ICR, and your contract will include an allowance clause for any future changes to your indirect cost rate. With budgeting, you can budget to your indirect cost rate during the contracting period or contract period. Of course, if your rate changes during a renewal period, you can work with your contracting agencies on any modifications that'll be needed. Finally, on invoicing, you will need to invoice your contracting agency based on actual expenses, even if your expenses are lower than your ICR. Also please note, to that effect, you cannot invoice for expenses over your ICR rate if your actuals are over that rate. So you can only invoice to that rate or below if your actual expenses are lower. And just noting that indirect costs are always subject to audit, so important to note that. Next slide. So once your ICR is accepted, the city implementation team will package all your application materials with a cover sheet. You can see the example here with the key information about your ICR rate, and we will upload it to your Passport profile. You can access this information by logging into Passport and navigating to your vendor profile and going under documentation. If you have a current accepted indirect cost rate with the city, it will be listed under the miscellaneous documents section. And we will label your attachments based on the method you use to apply. So whether it was de minimis, if you used an IAR, we'll save it as CPA certified indirect rate, or if you used a federal NICRA, we'll label as a federal certified indirect rate. So you'll be able to tell which entryway you followed the last time you applied based on how it's saved. And your validity period will also be included, so you'll know when your ICR is set to expire. Next slide. Great. So also in Passport, there's a new window where you can use Passport to do budgeting with your new indirect cost rate directly in Passport. So to access this page, you can go to the Financials tab at the top, go down to Browse Contract Budgets, and then click, there'll be a little pencil icon next to the contract. If you open that, you can then look at your contract budget. On the side, there's an overview window where you can see the general information. You can also go down to indirect rate to see the direct cost base on your contract. So you can use this to adjust your budgeting amounts and see how it will impact your indirect cost rate. Great. So next slide. Awesome. So that was our presentation. Thank you all for being here. We can now go through and answer any questions that have been included in the chat. So let's see. I know our team here has been answering some questions as we're going. So
there was one particular question, Alex, that I've seen come up several times,
yeah,
which goes back to something that I mentioned, which is which fiscal year of financials should people be submitting? And the short answer is whichever fiscal year you have completed and have financial reports or an audit for. The city certainly recognizes that we have providers who follow, a fiscal year similar to the cities versus some follow a more like a federal fiscal year and others use the calendar year. So you just use the most recent completed financials that you have available to you.
Great, thank you, Celeste.
Oh, and sorry, I also wanted to make one more note about sampling and testing. Alex mentioned that, this is a quality assurance. So if your indirect cost rate is selected for sampling and testing, that is in no way it in no way means that your indirect cost rate is not accurate. We simply sample a certain percentage so that we are able to, to assure a level of quality, and so that the city feels confident in the rates that are submitted. So hopefully, if you're sampled one round, you wouldn't be sampled again the next round, but it could happen. But generally, I just want to reassure folks that it does not mean your ICR is not accurate. It just is simply, some testing that we do as part of this process so that we don't have to look deeply into every single provider's documentation.
Great, thank you, Celeste. One thing to note too, and I know there are some questions about eligibility periods. If you follow the instructions we provided to look at if you have a currently accepted rate in Passport, if you follow that pathway through Passport, you can see your most recent rate, and it'll tell you when your validity period. So that's an easy way just to check whether your current ICR is still active and when it'll expire.
Ilke or Zia, do either one of you want to address some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat that might be relevant to the larger group?
Everyone. As Celeste addressed the question related to timing, I also just want to reiterate again that the independent accountant's report has to be based on the most recent available schedule of functional expenses, and of course calculated according to the treatment of costs as defined in the cost manual. On that note, there were a few questions related to the treatment of costs. I do want to note that we can't, as the city implementation team, we cannot provide guidance on allocating your organization's costs. So we do encourage you to work with your organization's financial experts, that may be your CFO, your ED, and of course your CPA, to review the definitions and the guidance for the commonly incurred costs that we've outlined in the cost manual. Related to that, there are, I think, some questions I saw concerning distorting costs, how to know if something is a distorting cost. This is also addressed directly in the cost manual. Because the city uses the simplified allocation methodology, distorting costs are actually outlined, and they're clearly defined in the cost manual. I believe we actually had a slide on what those were. Those include rent, subcontractor lines over 25,000, equipment over 5,000, and participant support costs. So these are all per the simplified allocation methodology seen as costs that distort your actualized indirect cost rate and indirect costs. And so they are excluded from the direct cost base that is used to arrive at your accepted ICR, as well as the budgeted ICR that is calculated directly in Passport. So again, one of the reasons that we say please consult your financial experts and your CPA is because all organizations outside of those distorting costs will have varied practices for how their organization treats certain costs, right? It will look different from one organization to the other. As I go through the other questions, another one that I saw, I think, related to sort of the communications between the city implementation team, your organization, and then city agencies. So when your organization applies through the CIT inbox, and that's the CIT at mocs.nyc.gov, email address. Our team will review your application and help you establish a city-approved ICR. What the city implementation team then does, and again, that's comprised of MOCS and OMB, we communicate that out to your contracting agencies in the city. So contracting agencies, those are your contracts with DYCD, aging, HPD, et cetera. They will be informed directly by us through our city communications. They will have access to a list of your accepted ICRs. And of course, we also upload that information into Passport for both your reference as well as city agencies. But you should not have to provide additional verification documentation to your city agency to prove that your city accepted ICR has been approved by our city implementation team.
A new question actually just came in that asked that whether an application must be filled out in order to use the de minimis rate, because some organizations may not have in the past filled out the form. Okay, do you want to address that one?
Any organization, even if electing to use the de minimis rate, which is currently 10%, still submit an application. Part of this is historic based on how we rolled out the initiative at the beginning. Only those organizations that had submitted applications, even if at the de minimis, were eligible for the funding initiative. So looking forward, in the event that we do any further enhancements to the policy, that's including the funding initiative, we do encourage your organization to submit an application so we have it for our records and for our internal awareness that your organization came in through the centralized application process. Otherwise, if you don't submit an application, you do default to the de minimis, but you may not be contacted in the future related to the policy if we don't have your organization and your primary contacts established through the centralized process. So again, we encourage, even if at the de minimis, to come in and establish a rate for our records.
And another question related to the de minimis rate, which is, what are the primary pros and cons of using the different entryways? And there's really just one foundational pro or con. If you use the de minimis rate, your indirect cost rate will be 10%. If you have a higher indirect cost than that, you will need to use either the indirect accountant's report or a NICRA, if you have it, to establish any rate that is higher than 10%. So, that's generally organizations that have, 15, 20% indirect costs. They will, they'll submit through one of the other entryways so that they can be reimbursed at that higher rate.
One question I see too, and I'll answer this maybe in two parts, because I think there's another question that's related. Somebody asked if their organization previously applied to the federal NICRA, but will not have an updated NICRA in time for the application. If you have the IAR materials, the independent accountant's report, and the schedule of ICR, you can certainly submit those in lieu of a NICRA as well. IAR and NICRA are just two alternative pathways, but please submit with what you have available. In terms of NICRAs, I did see a question around using provisional rates on a NICRA. Okay, correct me if I say anything wrong here, but we do accept provisional rates, but just know that that is the rate that you will be, that will be your new rate. So if your rate changes after that provisional period, you wouldn't be able to apply for a new rate until after your ICR with the city has expired.
Great, sorry about that. I do want to clarify, by application documents, If you are referring to the process of establishing a rate with the city, please make sure that you reach out to the city implementation team to, one, confirm your eligibility, and two, get the necessary application in order to enter the process. There isn't something currently centralized like we had during initiative rollout back in 2020. This process is handled directly through the city implementation team email address. The secondary part, once you do have a rate, what again we're calling the city accepted ICR, then your materials, including a cover letter based on your application and your entryway, is uploaded to Passport. So those are, the two aspects I wanted to address. But again, if you are looking to apply, please make sure that you reach out directly to that CIT email address to get the necessary materials and confirm your eligibility.
Okay, next slide. Awesome. So thank you all again for being here and participating in this webinar. I hope this was helpful and provided you with a lot of useful information for submitting an application. So just some next steps, one, as you're going to apply for your ICR, confirm your entryway, how you're going to apply, whether the de minimis or if you're applying for a higher than 10% rate, either through a federal NICRA or the independent accountant report. Make sure you have all the required verification documentation you need to submit your application. As you're calculating your rate, if you're using the independent accountant report entryway, please consult the city's cost manual and other resources on MOCS's website. Also, feel free to contact us at CIT@mocs.nyc.gov with any questions you have as you're submitting your application. And finally, just final reminder, please submit your application no later than December 8th, 2025. Next slide. So we've included some links to the resources here, and we can drop them in the chat. We have our ICR initiative webpage. There's a ton of really useful information there and just good background information on applying and using your ICR. There's also a link to the IAR template. So you can see how those independent accountant report letters should be structured. The ICR worksheet, this is a spreadsheet that you can use to calculate your ICR using the simplified allocation method. And then finally, the cost manual. This will tell you everything you need to know about allocating your costs. So please reference it when calculating your ICR. Great.
Yeah, and with that, we'll say thank you so much to everyone who has attended. I believe we're also going to try to put the recording of the webinar up on the webpage if you have other team members in your organization or your accountant who might benefit from seeing it. And again, reach out to us at any time at the email address at cit.mocs.nyc.gov. And with that, we'll say thank you. Have a great week, everyone.